Why did we start a podcast?
One thing that I've noticed in a lot of different interactions, whether it's at work around the Capitol or just out with friends, is there's a big lack of respect for people who you disagree with, whether that's on the other aisle politically or even with family. I feel like there's a lot of kids or young people around my age, high school, college age, who are constantly at odds with their parents about everything, whether it's, what they should study in college, what they should do career-wise, political beliefs. I know so many people or have heard or met of so many people who will just straight up do an opposite thing from what their parents said just because their parents said it. And I feel like we also see that reflected in the political world, where Republicans will react to something purely because the Democrats said it and vice versa, when really if you were to just take a pause, step back, it's really not something that should be an issue for either side. And my hope with this podcast is that we'll be able to really set an example for especially the young people and how to interact with people you disagree with in a respectful way and in a way that you can actually have a discussion instead of just bouncing off the walls and escalating. But whether that's in relationship with family or with people you disagree with politically.
Okay, I can respect that. And what's in a name? Because Raised a Rebel, and you and I were at odds with this for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And this may be a point that we don't agree on. But how did we end up with a name like Raised a Rebel podcast?
We still haven't fully ended up with the name. We keep going back and forth on what we should do. I feel like the name Raised a Rebel sounds a little bit like it's a parenting podcast of some sort. Like somebody's mom is going to listen to it to find out what the magic spell is to fix her kids and make them behave. Whereas my hope for the podcast is to really have thought-provoking discussions on current issues. So I just hope it doesn't give that vibe to it.
Well, and I kind of come at it from a different angle. I had a parent approach me probably 2 or 3 months ago and was curious, how did I end up raising 3 daughters who are so outspoken, independent, that love God, that love history, and are now getting into the political arena, all in their each unique way. And I had to really stop and think about that of like, what have I done in the last 18 plus years to instill in my kids that love of debate, but at the same time balanced with respect. And so when you came to me and said, hey, I want to do this podcast and I want to talk about political subjects, things that are going on today, that's how I took it, is I want to come on and show that counterpoint of ways that I can push you as a father, but then ways that I have to sit back and agree to disagree, because I think there are things that you and I will cover in this podcast that we will leave here still debating.
I know there will be, because we have things like that at home. I'm trying to remember, for an example, what was that one day we were like driving back home and you said something that to me was like wild and totally unhinged. It was something about how political candidates for the presidency should be like drawn randomly. And I'm like, no, in what world does that work?
We'll get into that later.
But anyways, just as an example, I guarantee you we will not agree on everything. I do think that's part of the importance of having a podcast like this, though, that we can talk openly about things, is because, like you said, people ask and are like, how have you instilled this in your kids? And I think a big part of that is open discussion. I can't think of a single time that I haven't felt Like I could come to either you or mom and say, hey, I had this thought, or I saw this, or I was reading this. Here's kind of what I'm thinking. And then we talk about it openly, whether it's faith-based, political, guidance with friendships, anything. Like, our family as a whole is always very open to discussion. And so I feel like this podcast, part of my hope for it is to show that to the world, you know. And I mean, obviously, we probably won't have that many people listening to our podcast, but that's the hope. And I keep saying it, but like, I love this little setup too, because it feels like a living room. And that's the kind of like place we'd have our discussions. I feel like all of our best discussions are either in the car, you know, whether it's hunting, driving to and from homeschool co-op, from church, or it's like staying up till 2 a.m. with mom on the couch, or with you just talking about stuff in our living room.
Well, I think as the podcast goes on, there will be a lot of examples of how you were started at a young age. And, you know, I always go back to, I've got pictures of you. You know, you can't be more than 2 or 3 years old, I think we've decided, on a parade float on a congressional campaign that I was helping with. And so I always go back to, like, we started you young, knowing that you can't complain unless you're active, unless you participate in that mechanism. And so why don't we get on to our first topic? And the list of topics we have will kind of jump all over the map. They could be historical, they could be current events, they could be political. But the first one I want to start out with, and I think you put this on here, was the National Guard deployment. And we got into this a little bit in the car on the way down to Yellowstone for Public Lands Day, but maybe catch us up. Where are we at right now with federalized troops being used in a policing action in communities? And let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I put that on the list because it's something that I've heard people saying all over, and I've heard people within the conservative movement have different takes on it. And I actually think it's quite annoying. I follow on social media a lot of, I'm going to say, like, younger political influencers, Gen Z commentators, and there's so many of them who are just like pro everything Trump says. If Trump says it, like, it might as well be in the Bible for them without even like thinking about it. And since it's not like a strict party line issue, but it is something that's very relevant, I thought it was something we should talk about on the podcast. My personal opinion is I think that there's a lot better ways to solve the issue of crime in our nation instead of deploying the National Guard, which is, I would say, borderline unconstitutional. We should instead be focusing additional efforts on better equipping our police force, because we have our police for a reason. And so it makes, to me, no sense to deploy the National Guard to do a role that the police literally exist for that exact reason. So I just think that our focus needs to be shifted.
Well, and I think it's interesting that if there's a natural disaster and we tap the National Guard, you know, which is, you know, a state organized, it's not federal, it has to be federalized. You're not sending in the U.S. military. These are National Guard troops. During a hurricane, nobody bats an eye, right? They show up, they bring food, they bring blankets, they provide medical care. But now the flip of the coin is we're using them in a policing action, which they may or may not have been trained for, because, you know, National Guard have different specialties. And now we're sending them into an urban setting in an enforcement action. And I think my concern with it, and you and I talked about this a little bit, is not necessarily with the National Guard, but with the district and county attorneys. So the National Guard rolls in and they arrest a bunch of people for whatever crime. It's then up to those attorneys, those district attorneys, those county attorneys, the prosecutors, to make the case and bring that to trial. And I think we've seen in some of these cities already that the issue is that prosecution arm letting people off without jail time or letting them go after multiple offenses. So why do we have National Guard troops when it's the prosecution side and the court system that doesn't seem to be upholding their end?
there's so many parts of the whole system that need attention. Like, I think for Montana specifically, one of the things that comes up all the time that I hear people talking about is how, we don't have enough space in our prisons. I know there's talk of building like another women's prison or a women's prison in Butte, and I hear people really, really against that because they don't want a prison in their town, and so I hear that side of things. They're like, no, we don't want a prison in our town. But on the other side of things, I hear people saying we need more space in our prisons. Right now, a lot of Montana inmates are being held in other states. And I know that's a fairly common thing for states to do, but it does cost our state a lot more money to have to do that. And so it's like our law enforcement needs attention, our judicial system needs attention, and then our prison system needs attention. So which one of those three do you need to focus on first? Because if you streamline our law enforcement, then what? Then it falls apart at the judicial level. And if we completely smooth over our judicial level and the prosecution is no longer an issue, then what do you do with those now convicted felons, right? That's the question. So you just got to figure out what's the order of priorities to allow you to do all those things. And I personally don't think that deploying the National Guard would fix much of that.
I think we need to go back to chain gangs. I think, we talk about ways to resolve the prison issue. Why not go back to work parties, right? Shoveling civic projects, put them to work.
Because then we get told that that's a concentration camp, and that's not a good look.
Is it about a good look, or is it about, keeping cities safe? So, okay. I think we're mostly in agreement on the National Guard deployment.
On that point, this is one thing I heard one of those Gen Z commentators say, and their example for why the National Guard should be deployed was something about how, like, in communist Russia, the military was used as or during the Soviet Union in Russia, how the military was used as a police force and how that solved all their crime. And I was like, dude, are you really comparing the United States to the Soviet Union and Russia? Is that really the look we want? And I feel like it comes down to a similar thing as, like, well, sure, you could fix the problem, but it's not going to be ethical. It's not going to be constitutional. It's going to create issues, and it's going to be divisive. And yeah, anyways.
Okay. So I've got one more for you because we don't want this to go on too long. Why is it important that young people are involved in community, in politics, in other facets of life?
Okay. I'm going to read one of my, like, all-time favorite quotes ever. It's from Ronald Reagan, and I think this sums up basically all of it. So he said, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same, or one day we'll spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it once was like in the United States where men were free."
Are we already there? Are we already telling the stories?
This is a slightly different topic. Is I hear a lot of people will be like, well, right now is the worst things have ever been. During COVID, people said, oh, this is the worst point in human history. And I'm like, dude, sorry, 1 in 3 Europeans died during the Black Death. It could be worse. And I feel like a lot of people carry that mentality into a lot of things today, is what is happening in the present is the worst it's ever been. And I think that is a misinterpretation. And so I think sometimes when people are like, we're already there, to say that we're already there is like admitting that the fight has already been lost. And I don't think the fight's already been lost.
But if I look at your generation, it's the hardest it's ever been for your age to get a job, to buy a house, to raise a family. And I know it's significantly harder now than it was for me 20 years ago. The 20 years have been brutal for how we live, the cost of inflation. Just, I look at, you drive my old truck. This is an ongoing story, Little Red.
Yeah.
Right? Little Red is 21 years old. She's a great little truck. Oh, she's more than 21 now, isn't she? She's 26.
She can drink.
She can drink. She's old enough to drink. And that car new now is double the price than when I bought it. And if I look at what I was making out of college versus now, it's definitely not over double. So why be involved? Let's go back to that original question. Why do parents, why do we need to be involved in politics, the community, and what's going on?
Because we can't give up the fight. I heard someone compare the political culture of America to being a church that doesn't prioritize its youth group. And so as the years go on, the pastor retires, the congregation grows old, people start dying off. And then where's the church? There's no youth to take that place, to come up and be the next leadership. And I feel like there's a very loud voice in society that is saying, oh, these young people, these iPad kids, these Gen Z social media, TikTok dancers are just there's no hope. But you can't just be okay with that. You can't be okay with saying that there's no hope, because what does that leave? That leaves nothing. To say that there's no hope for the next generation is just to admit defeat and say America is done for. And I think that if we want to see the next generation step up and change that narrative, then it has to start now. It does no good to say, oh yeah, when they grow up a little bit more, once they get through this little phase of, whatever they're in, then maybe they can be involved. That does no good, There are people who are on fire, and there are people my age in college and high school who are ready to be involved, who are ready to jump in, and who are ready to work hard. I would say, especially with some of the recent events, with Charlie Kirk's assassination, there are young people on fire, and we need to really be fostering that. There's a revival in our nation happening, both faith-wise, but also in the sense of a reawakening of this desire to be involved in your community and in politics. And I don't think anyone, when you look at the big picture, can sit back and say, you know what, I'm happy with being that old church that just dies out. Nobody wants that. And so if that's what we're trying to avoid, then we need to be sowing into our youth, and we need to be equipping them and encouraging them to step up to the bar. And so that as a whole is why it is so important to really pour into these youth. I also think an important thing is to point out is that other groups recognize that through history. It's been a trend that's seen over and over. The liberals know it. Why else do you think that woke ideology is pushed so heavily in high schools and in colleges? It's because they know that the youth is where it's at. Part of how Trump won the election is because he won over the youth. And so because of that, you have all of these different sides pouring in on them, trying to win over the youth, because eventually the youth become the working class and they become your political leaders. And it's easier to indoctrinate someone when they're young and naive. And so as young people, we need to be spending a lot of time to educate ourselves and to push ourselves to really think critically and think logically and question what we hear. We can't just be in one ear and then out the other, but we also can't be in one ear and it's automatically the truth. We need to be really wrestling with things. I also want to point out another group that prioritized the youth and saw the value in them was the fascist party. That's one of the core strains of it is, it's this whole almost caste system of ability. And so what is the most capable, the strongest physically, and a lot of times in some instances mentally, it's the youth, And so if you're trying to build up an army, like I would say Nazi Germany was, you need to get at those youth, right? And so you can see, I would just encourage you to go and really dig into what fascism is. I've been kind of studying it recently because it's a term that you hear thrown around all over the place from both sides of the aisle, but nobody seems to actually know what it is. But that is one of the major things, is that the fascist party saw the value in pouring into their youth and investing in their youth. And if the youth is a power that can be used for evil, it's also one that can be used for good. And so we need to jump on that train and encourage them, because they're there, they're ready, and they all want to do good. It's just a matter of the rest of society being willing to foster them and support them in that. Now, I've done a lot of talking, so I want to hear your side of it.
Well, I think as we continue on in the podcast, I think one of the things I want to visit is the ways that we as a family have encouraged not only that critical thinking, but that exploration through history, and how you felt that there's a place for you to volunteer, to be involved, right? We had that discussion with your younger sister. We were down in Yellowstone this weekend doing a service project. She's looking at her over in the corner, and she didn't want to go. And she's like, all I'm going down to is to work. We're like, that's the point. You're going down to volunteer. It's a service project. We're going down to help make something better. And we laugh about it and we call it, it's forced family fun time. But it's trying to pass on that idea that, it's about more than just what you're interested in and what you're doing. And I want to explore that in future podcasts in ways that, your mom and I and we as a family have encouraged that, have cultivated that. And, not only you guys, but we look at some of your community and some of your friends and kind of done the same thing for them. Open that discussion, encouraged other parents to be involved in a different way with their kids. It's not just showing up to soccer practice and saying, yay, we all won, you scored a goal. It's teaching kids, how do you make an impact on society? And I think that's something I really want to get into as we move forward as well. But I think the youth are there. I mean, Mom and I have been involved with youth before we even had kids. We were volunteers on different aspects, and I continue today. Right. I work with youth at the state level. I'm encouraging youth. We're always involved with stuff. So I just want to, we'll leave it at that. But as we get into future podcasts, I want to explore those reasons behind why you think it's so important and how we've encouraged you to take that role in the community. So with that, I think we'll draw our very first podcast to an end. And thanks for listening. We're looking forward to the next one.